Right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to STORYCRAFT Conversations. Thank you for attending, everyone. Thank you to the amazing Janie Chang for coming and talking to us tonight. I'm Claire Mulligan. I'm an editor, an author, creative writing instructor, and screenwriter, and at the mulliganmethod.ca. My co-host, lovely co-host down here, April Bosshard. She is also an author, an editor, a creative writing instructor, and a story consultant, and of deepstorydesign.com. So we were both fascinated by the writing process and about how different writers find their path and find their technique. So we wanted to create a series where we can all learn from that, as well as just learn about the joy of reading and different books and all that sort of stuff. So thank you for coming. So yeah, the questions, all caps, as we go along, can go into the chat so that we can do the Q&A afterwards. I am going to do a slideshow because I love slideshows. So we're going to do a little slideshow so we can learn more about Janie's books before we get started. So there's Janie Chang in her garden. So I'm going to talk about her 5 novels because they're all, I think of them as kind of, they almost work together musically in a way, right? All your novels, Janie, I think they sort of work together so well. So this is her first novel was Three Souls, published in 2014. Set in 1935 China. Guided by her three souls, Lian's ghost must understand the mysteries and mistakes of her past or else be barred from entering the afterlife. And that was a finalist for the BC Book Prizes and nominated for the International Dublin Literary Award, which is a really big...
And that was when I met Claire and Roberta.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. We met at the Vancouver Writers Festival. Yeah, when we did a reading together, and I was doing Bust Jim. Her second novel was Dragon Springs Road, set in 1908 Shanghai, when abandoned 7-year-old Eurasian outcast Jailing is forced to become a bond servant, but then a fox spirit offers help. And this was also nominated for the International Dublin Literary Award, and it was a Globe and Mail national bestseller. And then, sorry, I have to move people here. The next book was The Library of Legends, set in 1937 Nanking. As bombs fall and war batters even the guardian spirits, Hu Lian joins her university's 1,000-mile flight to safety, all while protecting a priceless library of ancient myths. This was a Book of the Month Club pick, nominated for the Evergreen Award and a Globe and Mail national bestseller. And we have The Porcelain Moon, set in 1918 France. Fleeing an arranged marriage, Pauline Deng seeks help from her cousin in the Chinese labor corps and then finds refuge with Frenchwoman Camille, leading to a perilous decision that changes their lives. And her latest book was The Phoenix Crown, San Francisco, 1906. Aspiring soprano Gemma and Chinatown embroideress Su Ling cross paths through a powerful collector and the fabled Phoenix Crown. When an earthquake strikes and the crown vanishes, their lives unravel until the crown resurfaces years later in Paris. And that was a Globe and Mail #1 instant bestseller, a USA Today bestseller, and an NPR Best Book of the Year. And that was written in collaboration with Kate Quinn, which is a fascinating process that we're going to find out more about. Janie, you have amazing first lines in your novels. And the first one from Three Souls, I use in my teaching sometimes to show how to come out with a bang and have these first lines that raise story questions, set the table for what's to come, create a story premise, create a world. And I think you do this beautifully in all your novels. So I just want to read them out so we can get a feel for them. From Three Souls, we have 3 souls, or so I've been told, but only in death could I confirm this. From the Library of Legends, the approaching aircraft were too far away for Lian to tell whether they were Chinese or Japanese. From the Porcelain Moon, but I don't want to get married, she thought. The letter fluttered from her hand. From Dragon Springs Road, the morning my mother went away, she burnt incense in front of the fox altar. So, Janie, I guess my question to you is, how did you come about these amazing openings and first lines, and was it hard to do process?
For first book, everything was a lot easier. I think the story
Mhm.
just came to me, the opening scene just came to me. And then for the others, by the time I wrote my second book, I was far more aware of you need to start with a really good hook. So it took more work. So for every book since my first one, it's a conscious effort.
Hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. It often happens the first novel somehow is easier. I'm not sure why. And then the next.
Because you're so blissfully ignorant.
Yeah. Uh, so many of these, where the three souls in particular in the Library of Legends are more or less inspired by some family stories. How did you weave
Yes.
their experiences in these stories into your work?
Okay. Well, Three Souls is based on my grandmother's life. And I always knew that if I were to write a novel, that would be the story that I would use uh, as the core of the plot, because my grandmother really did try to run away from home to get an education. And then she
Mhm.
was like stopped at the train station and dragged home again and married off in disgrace.
Right.
So I always thought that was a sad story. And then for the Library of Legends, it occurred to me that my father's life as a student, as a refugee student during the Japanese invasion of China, it was an episode in history that not a lot of people outside China knew about.
Mhm.
And as is the way with when you're writing historical fiction and you're doing your research, you think you've got your story all laid out, and then you do your research and this absolute nugget of gold comes up and you think, I have got to find a way to fold that into the story. And in this particular case, it was learning about a university
Mhm.
where the students and the faculty and the servants and packed up the books and the lab equipment and the animals from the animal husbandry and agriculture department, and they went east, yeah, further, no, west, into deeper into China, to get away from the invading armies. And one of these universities actually carried with them one of the great literary treasures of China that
Mhm.
they felt that they had to protect with their life because it was a national treasure. It was their legacy, it was their culture. And when I read about that, I just about burst into tears because, first of all,
Right.
it
Yeah.
spoke of such sacrifice,
Mhm.
and it also was just such an amazing metaphor. I mean, a library, it's it's got legs, right? You can just pile so much meaning on top of it.
Yeah.
So I had to like rejig my original plot.
Hmm. Yeah, no, it's a wonderful premise, and just the idea of a journey, of course, right? It lends itself so well to a story and having this, yeah, what's at stake so much, not just their lives, but as you said, the legacy of China. I love that book.
Yeah.
And beating
So I
the
do
drama.
like, I do feel really lucky to have a lot of family stories
Mm-hmm.
that my father told me,
Mm-hmm.
and to be able to pull them into my novels, because I think it's one thing to research and it's another to have heard the lived experience, and I
Yeah.
always feel that if I'm able to incorporate some of that into a novel, then somehow it just breathes more authenticity, more
Mhm.
meaning into it. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, there's many, many of the people I, consult with and who come to my classes, they have family stories they want to write or, keep alive somehow. Um, do you have any tips for how they can get those stories or what would be the best?
hmm I think that the first thing that people have to get out of their heads is, oh, I need to write it down.
Mhm.
What you what you're trying to do is not write it down. What you're trying to do is capture that story.
Yeah.
So, and
Yes.
also, I mean, family stories, whether it's you and your memory gets worse and worse as you get older, definitely,
Mhm.
I know that, or if it's a parent or a grandparent
Mhm.
and they die and those stories are lost, or they're getting older and those stories are lost to dementia. Or like my mom, she always used to say, "Oh, nothing ever interesting really ever happened in my life." And I'm like, "Mom, you lived through like the Japanese invasion of China and you were a
Yeah.
refugee in Shanghai and, you know, how could you say your life was not interesting?" So just capture it.
Mm.
Put them in, put that person in front of a tape recorder. My age is showing a tape recorder, or video them. But, get an audio recording
Mm.
if that's the best that you can do,
Yeah.
right? Because then it's captured.
Yeah.
And it's so much easier for people to just talk about it
Mhm.
rather than think, oh, now I need to sit down and write. Because for a lot of people, it doesn't come naturally, the writing
Yeah.
thing, right?
Mhm.
And then for a lot of people, maybe you need to encourage them. You need to sort of interview them and ask questions and show interest in your
Yeah.
family history to get that information. And I'm just saying, if you're even thinking of it now, compiling family history, then do it now because memory is so ephemeral.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, thank you. Yeah, that makes sense. I think when people feel they're being listened to and their life has interest and merit, and often I get that from my parents as well. My dad when he was alive, not that interesting. Not it's like actually it is. Like yeah, like let's hear it. Your work has often been called using magic realism or in the genre of magic realism. There's
Hmm.
ghosts, there's spirits, there's all this stuff. But you're not crazy about that label. Can you? Yeah.
It kind of annoys me, yeah.
Annoys you, yes.
And and the reason is that I mean, I write extensively about the lives of Chinese women, and it's in the past, and
Mhm.
it's a lot of it is, World War II or before, and it's a time when people still kind of believed in the supernatural.
Right?
So when the supernatural makes an appearance in my novels,
Mhm.
they are explicitly Chinese. They are out of folklore that I have researched.
Yeah.
And it's really important that it should be out of Chinese tradition and out of Chinese folklore because
Mhm.
I want my characters to recognize that supernatural being when they see it, you know.
Mhm.
And in some cases, it's not a surprise to them because it's familiar to
Mhm.
them, right? And in some cases, it's like, oh, I didn't realize that we were traveling with a supernatural creature. But in all these situations, um, I think that by the way that the character responds to the supernatural being, you also understand what the manifestation is supposed to be,
Mhm.
how they're supposed to behave, how you would expect, for example, a fox spirit to
Mhm.
behave.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's not really magical. It's just realism.
It's
For
it
them, it's
was the
realism. This is
reality.
their
Yeah,
world, right? Oh, I
yeah,
like that. Yeah.
yeah. It's the reality of their belief system, right?
Yeah. Is there a big difference between like Western style ghosts and Chinese ghosts and supernatural beliefs and things?
Well,
That.
so in someone was talking about the hopping ghost, and I think they're a
Mhm.
vampire, kind of a ghost. But in the story that I'm writing, my current story,
Mm.
um,
Right here.
it talks about the ghosts of suicides.
Right.
So the ghosts of suicides in Chinese folklore tradition are the absolute worst ghosts that you can meet
Mm.
because they are trapped in the afterlife, and the only way that they can go on to reincarnation is to drive another person to commit suicide and replace them in the afterlife. So it's just sort of this
Oh.
never ending cycle of suicide and driving people to madness or whatever it takes to get them to kill themselves. So that is like considered one of the worst kinds of ghosts. And there's also, the ghosts of people who've died by drowning, and they're always sort of hanging around wherever it was that they drowned and waiting to pull in the next victim. So there's so in my novel, I have this young Chinese boy servant who said, "So, this Western guy died in China. Do you think his ghost follows Western rules, or do you think he has to follow Chinese ghost rules?"
That's brilliant. Because yeah, you wouldn't know. Oh, that's so interesting.
So that's where you kind of wander into, is it real? But for the characters in the book, it's
Mhm.
real. Right?
Yeah, and I think you have to just approach it that way. Absolutely realistic. Yes.
Hmm. Yeah.
I've got some true and false questions for you.
Okay.
Okay. So, ghosts inhabit this world and have stories to tell. So, do you believe this? Like, do you believe in ghosts, basically?
Yes. Maybe not like ghosts like in folklore, but I believe
Mhm.
there's some sort of a spirit or presence that may linger on.
Okay, awesome. Objects have a kind of life. I guess I'm asking this because so many of all your books, the way you describe objects is so like I can almost touch them. You know, the way they feel, the porcelain, the just everything. The Phoenix Crown, of course, being, all about, this tangible object that has so much significance. And it just feels like, do you think objects have a kind of life, certain objects?
Well, I think mostly in our own heads because we imbue them with qualities. Like when I was cleaning out my mom's house after we'd moved her
Mhm.
into care, it was so horrible trying to decide what to throw away because it was
Yeah,
all about her, you know?
yeah,
And yeah.
yeah,
And yet it was I don't know, it was something stupid and cheap, but it it had
yeah,
belonged to my mother, right? So
yeah. Aw. Um, would your ancestors and relatives would be delighted to appear in your work? True or false?
I think true because my my dad's family in particular, he comes from a long line of scholars. So
Mhm.
anything to do with literature and writing, they would be
Mhm.
pleased.
Yeah,
And I try to treat them with respect in my
yeah,
books because
yeah.
they are my elders.
What about your grandmother? Would she be pleased?
My grandmother, well, my grandmother, of course, in fiction, you have to make things a little bit more exciting.
Mhm.
So my grandmother, I'm pretty sure, did not have a red hot love affair with a left-wing poet, but I threw that into the story because, it's fiction.
Yeah. Maybe she would love that. Who knows?
Maybe she kind of wished she could have.
Right? Okay. And my other question is, you should work on many projects at one time, true or false?
False. I'm
False.
a serial monogamist when it comes to
Okay.
writing. Yeah,
That's
you
it.
just can't afford. I have friends who seem to have six stories going on in their head at the same time,
Yeah.
and maybe a couple of manuscripts going on at the same time in different
Mhm.
stages of completion. But for me, it's hard enough to just focus on one story and get it done and meet your deadlines. If I had more than one, nothing would ever happen. Nothing would ever get completed.
Yeah, I think, but again, a novel is many stories, I suppose, right? So in some way, that's enough juggling when you're doing a novel
Oh,
because you have many stories in a novel.
that's a
Phoenix
very, very
Crown.
good point. That's a really good point.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Writing is best done in A, the city, B, the country, or C, while you're traveling.
Hmm. I think B, the country, because this is where I am now, and there's fewer distractions, and
Okay.
it's quieter.
And it's quieter because you moved
Yeah.
from Vancouver to the
Hmm.
Sunshine Coast not too long ago.
Yeah.
Well, 2 years.
Yeah. We were like two houses away from Boundary Road. It was noisy at times.
It was, right? Yeah. So you really like it there? Close to the ocean and the
Yes, love the Sunshine Coast,
oh,
which I never thought I was a country girl, but it turns out rural lifestyle is really good. And of course, the Sunshine Coast Festival of the Written Arts,
yes,
it's
amazing.
just terrific every year. I
Mhm.
love being part of the audience, thank goodness, and not having to be up there on stage and just sort of enjoying what other authors have to say and listening to them read. It just so much more relaxing.
Yeah, it's an amazing festival. I was there 1 year too.
Hmm. Yeah.
Fabulous. Um, you were not always a best-selling historical novelist. You had another career and a life. Can you tell us more about your writing journey and how you came to be an author?
I graduated from computing science at Simon Fraser. So, and spent, couple of decades in the tech world.
Yeah.
But even then, I sort of moved from the technical side of the computing of the corporate life into sort of the marketing part of it,
Hmm.
where I would describe my job as turning, you know, tech talk into business English and making getting people who were not technical to understand what the benefits were. And so I was always writing, you
Hmm.
know, whether it was, user guides or marketing brochures or whatever, I was always writing. And then my mom um, got dementia, and at one point we had to move her into care. And I would go visit her, and every time I visited her, I'd be looking around at all the other residents. I'm thinking, how many of these people are wishing they had tried harder to work at their dream?
Wow.
And do I want to be sitting in my rocking chair one day thinking I should have tried harder to be a writer? So I thought, Janie, you better get your butt in gear and do something about it. And the first thing that I did was I took a writing course with Caroline Anderson.
Yay! Who was our last
Yeah,
speaker? Yes.
yeah. And from there,
Awesome.
and then she was telling everybody in the class about the writer's studio at SFU. So after Caroline's course, I applied because you have to submit a portfolio. So I applied to the writer's studio and I got in. So I was class of 2011,
Mm-hmm.
and it was the most amazing experience because it was just a completely different discipline from the tech world.
Imagine.
And yeah, it was. And I just, and it was really good because it taught you not just about the craft of writing, but also the business of writing, like what does an agent do for you? How, what do publishers do? What kind of marketing do you have to do for yourself? What is standard in a publishing contract, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it really kind of knocks some of these illusions out of you, I think I said to you, my first book, I was just so blissfully ignorant, right? And
Yeah.
then now it's sort of like there's so much of the business of writing that you have to deal with. But the third thing that I thought SFU's Writer Studio did really well was they taught you about the importance of the community of writing. So people like you, Claire, and Roberta, because, and just to try and have a community of writers for
Mm-hmm.
mutual support to help each other, whether it's, could you read my first chapter and tell me if it's crap, all the way to here you are, doing this workshop and
Yeah.
and here I am, or just because when you moan about something that you're going through, only another writer would
Yeah.
understand and not think you were just whining
Hmm.
incessantly.
Exactly. And you can have
Yeah.
passionate conversations about the serial comma versus the Oxford comma, stuff like that. Yeah. That nobody else will care about. Or research
Yeah.
and all that sorts of things. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I find that really interesting because it's such a different background from writing. But at the same time, I
Mm-hmm.
imagine there's some crossover because writing's very, in some ways, methodical and a little math. I wouldn't say mathematical, but analytical, right?
Well,
We have pieces
so
together.
I think, my husband, nearly got punched in the face after my
Yeah.
first book, like when I finished the manuscript, and he
Uh-huh.
said, "This is really good, honey. You should have done this 20 years ago." And I wish I had, because it would have been easier to be a success 20 years before, we got into it. But at the same time, who's to say that 20 years ago you would have been ready, that
Yeah.
you would have had the maturity, that you would have
Yeah.
had the discipline, that you would have
Yeah.
had the life experience to put
Yeah.
that into your stories? Some people are just prodigies, and they can do that.
Mhm.
And some of us are not such prodigies.
Well, I think that's the beauty of writing, though, because obviously you do see prodigies, but that's because it's unusual to see people managing to produce a
Mhm.
really interesting piece of literature under the age of 25 or 30, right? So
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Hmm.
love that. This is something we can aspire to at any age and bring in our past careers and knowledge and lives and things like that.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And you know what? One of the things that people sometimes daydream about is they're going to write a book and it's going to be a bestseller. Oh my goodness. Like
Mhm.
debut
Yeah.
novels that are bestsellers, the reason they make the news is because it is so extremely rare. You
Yeah.
know, most of us kind of slog away
Mhm.
um, before getting to the breakout book. You look at
Yeah.
my friend Kate Quinn, she
Yeah.
actually wrote 6 or 8 novels set in
Wow.
Rome, ancient Rome, a
Great.
Renaissance Italy. And it wasn't until so maybe her ninth book, The Alice Network, that
Right.
was her breakout novel. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and that's interesting. Sometimes just catching the zeitgeist, sometimes catching a topic or subject that hasn't been
Hmm.
covered before. I don't think the female spies in World War II had been that
Right.
covered before.
Oh,
So
right.
yeah,
Well, I'll give you
hard to
another
know,
ex yeah.
right? It's a
An
crapshoot.
another example is my friend Jennifer Robson. She
Mm.
wrote, what was it, like Good Night from London or something like that. It's she had written a First World War novel or two or three, and they were not going anywhere,
Mm.
right? And then Downton Abbey became a real big hit, and suddenly
Ah,
publishers were looking for, you know, pre First World War or
okay.
just after First World War
Mhm.
stories. So, yeah.
It's a Yeah, it is a matter of luck and zeitgeist for sure. Yeah.
Hmm. Hmm.
Uh, oh yeah, well, I guess we should. I would love to know more about the Phoenix Crown, and because this novel, was co-written. Is that the right word, or
Co-authored? Yeah.
co-authored?
Yeah.
I think in a way, I don't think anyone's done this before, have they? Where
Oh,
you,
there are, trust
but
me.
this way, because oh well, okay, I'll let you talk about it because I just find it fascinating. So the Phoenix Crown was written, co-authored with you and Kate, Kate
Yes.
Quinn. So yeah, just tell us about that and the challenges.
So I think when Kate first came to me with the idea, I
Mhm.
was a little bit dubious. And it's because we were such good friends.
Mhm.
And I did not want to write a
Yeah,
book and then and then we were no longer speaking to each other,
yeah.
because we had heard horror stories. I mean, you said you think that this is so unique, but actually we know quite a few, like probably like two, 2 or 3
Mhm.
sets of authors who co-write
Okay.
quite often. Yeah, and and we had heard like at least one of a pair. It was a horror story, and we did not to repeat that.
Mhm.
We didn't. Yeah. So we were extremely careful and respectful about the way we did it.
Mhm.
And we also plotted it out to the nth degree because,
Mhm.
first of all, we were remote.
Mhm.
So we knew we had to be super organized about it.
Mhm.
And the other thing was, we didn't actually have that much time to write it because, for some stupid reason, when we proposed the book, our editor, so we have the same publishing house and we have the same agent, so that makes things a
Right.
little bit easier. Our editor said, well, I know, Janie, you've got a book coming out in such and such a day, and Kate, you've got another book coming out in such and such a day. Do you think you could write the Phoenix Crown so it comes out in the middle of it? And we're like, well, a novel is 100,000 words. We're splitting it between us. That's only
Hard can
50,000
it
words
be?
each. How hard can it be, right? Oh my God.
Oh my gosh.
So, so what we did was we used technology.
Mhm.
We used a spreadsheet on Google Docs.
Mhm.
Every chapter, like after we'd written, like the overall plot, we laid it out chapter by chapter. She wrote the chapters from Gemma's point of view. I wrote the chapters from Suling's point of view, but every row on that spreadsheet starts the chapter starts with this, the chapter ends with this. So even if we were writing ahead of each other, we always knew how to dovetail the action because we really wanted it to be seamless.
Yeah.
We didn't want readers to be jarred,
Mhm.
by a sudden change, um, in the action, or even that the voices were too different. Although that worked out okay because, we were writing two very different women. So they had two
Yeah.
very different voices. So it
Mhm.
really didn't matter. and we were really careful to always make comments like in those bubbles on the side in
Yeah.
Word, because the horror story that we heard was like this one author who would just like type over her co-author's
Oh,
writing, like
no.
edit in line without asking permission, without having a discussion, so on. So
Yeah.
we were very, very careful, and it really helps that we were both fans of each other's work, and yeah. And it also really, really helped that we're both workaholics,
Right.
because you know how it goes if you're working on a group project and someone is not doing their share, you can end up with a lot of resentment. It
Yeah.
really helped that neither of us are morning people,
Right.
because we're just like, yeah. So we were working the same hours. What else? And we both have a deep and abiding faith in spreadsheets that you
Okay.
can, yeah, if you can, yeah. So that's really the way that we did it. And we probably got together a face to face just 4 or 5 times, three
Mhm.
times to do the plotting,
Mhm.
like the very detailed plotting.
Mhm.
We actually checked into a hotel, and I plugged my laptop into the big screen, the hotel room TV,
Yeah.
and with the spreadsheet there, we were like filling it out. And then we checked when we were doing the final round of edits, like it had come back from our editor. We checked into the Sylvia Hotel in
Oh,
on
love
English
that
Bay,
hotel.
and we
Yeah.
just basically locked ourselves in there for 4 days. We only emerged like to buy some takeout food and go back to the room and keep on working. And yeah, there
Oh,
was a
well,
couple of
it's
times when either one of us almost had a nervous breakdown. So Kate went to Hawaii for 4 days to get over her nervous breakdown, and my husband and I moved house from Vancouver to the Sunshine Coast, and that was my nervous breakdown. So
oh, that sounds like fun. Not so much. Was there anything you learned specifically about story, do you think? Or any like
I
with
think
the piece with that book?
I'm more of a plotter now,
Mm,
because I used to be like
yeah.
half pantsing, half plotting, but I just saw how much more efficient it was when you got down to the writing if you
Mhm.
knew
Yeah.
what you were going to write about.
Mhm.
And it was just so much better than just, what's the word for it, organically getting to the middle of the story. And
Yeah.
suddenly you realize you didn't know how to connect the middle to the ending. Like, beginning's
Yeah.
great. The ending, you've got this great idea for the ending, and then the middle just kind of sags. But if you've got it plotted out,
Okay.
it's you can work on it on the spreadsheet, and
Yeah.
then you're just basically, writing the story based on that. But you still need to be like very open to new ideas, and
Mhm.
for historical fiction, as you
Mhm.
find some nugget of interest, and you decide it's worth changing the story for.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. So maybe we should all pretend we have a writing partner who's gonna get mad at us if we don't figure out just have an imaginary one in the back of our minds. That is so interesting. I guess, with screenwriting, we do this all the time. There's collaboration work, and again,
uh-huh.
and it's seen as odd almost not to do collaborate, whereas with authors, it's seen as the reverse, right?
Yeah. I
Um,
know we're solitary introverts for the most part.
yeah, interesting. I want to ask you about your next book, the book you're working on right now. And thank you so much for taking time out of that hard work, which I know you're hard at work at it right now, to do this interview.
Well, this my next book is called The Fourth Princess,
Mhm.
and it's a Gothic novel set in old Shanghai,
Yeah.
because I love Gothic novels, and I thought I'd really love to write one.
Mhm.
And found that actually, even though it was historical, it's set
Mhm.
in 1911. It's a time of great political and social transition, which is always an interesting time.
Mhm.
Um, interesting setting for a novel, because as you know, in novels you have to have conflict, the more the better. And
Mhm.
if there's this background of political turbulence,
Mhm.
so much the better. But what I found was really difficult is that normally when you're writing historical fiction,
Mhm.
what is going on out
Yeah.
in the outside world, um, the politics, the social change, and so on, that that affects the characters.
Yeah.
Because if you've got characters and they're living in the middle of, I don't know, revolutionary Paris,
Yeah.
and somehow they're traipsing through life oblivious to it, then it's not credible, right?
Yeah. No.
But in a Gothic novel, I was partway through and I thought, this is just not Gothic-y. What is wrong? What is wrong? And I sort of sat back and realized in a Gothic novel, the danger is from within. That's why there's always this mysterious mansion and some
Yeah.
secret and in the back. And the problem was I had veered away
Mhm.
from the internal dangers. And I was trying to do my usual thing of pulling in all this historical detail.
Mhm.
So this is like the least historically detailed of my novels so far, because everything actually has to come, the danger, the interest, the tension has to come from within the mansion. So,
Ah, that's amazing. So yeah, it just goes to show how important it is to know your genre and know
mhm.
what you're writing and explore make sure you follow the tropes. They're there for a reason, right? Because they're powerful. And yeah,
Yeah,
with historical,
because
go ahead.
oh no, just when I figured that out, and I just felt so stupid because it was so obvious.
No, it's not because you're in the trenches and there's so many, as you said, with historical fiction, so many amazing things. And indeed, historical fiction is, as we say, it's not timeless, right? It is bound to a time.
Hmm.
But romance, well, yeah. I mean, sometimes when you work in these genres, they're still, I think, important the setting and the time. But yeah, exactly. It's more important the interiority of the character. Is this the one? So this is the one that's gonna be dealing with the suicides, the ghosts?
Suicide Ghost, yes.
I can't wait. Oh, it's gonna be so cool. That's-
Yeah.
Is it
I'm
being,
just glad it's over.
yeah, because it's in
Yeah.
copy edit now, right?
It's in copy edit now, but when it comes back, I'm going to beg for a little bit more time because,
Mhm.
there's a few more things you can do to polish. And
Yeah.
that's the editor's job, which is
Yeah.
to say, knock it off. You're done.
You gotta get it to press.
Yeah.
Well, I really look forward to seeing that one. Has that been a fun genre for you to do? Is there another genre you'd like to write besides, we have Gothic and
Well, I
historical.
really love speculative fiction,
Yeah.
sci-fi and fantasy, but I don't think I could do that because you read books. I mean, the imagination that's required is so incredible for some of these worlds, really.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
So,
They say, historical fiction is like reverse fantasy, though, sometimes, or sort of a fantasy in some ways, because, you have to create a whole different world for your reader and draw
I
them
know, and so one of the things that really makes me laugh is when someone says to a historical novelist, "Oh, but it must be so easy. You already know what happened."
in.
Makes you want to tear your hair out, right?
Absolutely. Um, okay, so do you have any passages you'd like to read us? Can you read us a passage? I was thinking something
Okay.
ever you like to,
Well,
but if there's something that you can offer us that
hmm.
had a particular challenge for you or something.
So when we were talking like last week,
Mhm.
and you were talking about, well, how do you get a sense of history
Mhm.
into your novels? Uh, and I had said that I always thought that one of the worst things that you could do was sort of turn your story into a history lesson, you
Yeah.
know. And so and the thing is, we're living in Canada. I'm writing to a mostly Western audience who may
Mhm.
not know very much about Chinese culture, right?
Mhm.
So, how do you get them to understand that something is significant, right?
Neat. Yeah. Yeah.
So, and a lot of times it is through the actions and the reactions
Mhm.
of your characters.
Oh,
Um, so, I'm just going to read really quickly a passage from Dragon Springs Road
okay.
where Jialing, who's the abandoned orphan, and she's become a bond servant in this rich merchant's household. And this rich merchant has a first wife who hasn't been able to give him children.
Okay.
First wife had become increasingly eccentric. She had come to the nursery only once to congratulate third wife on the birth of her son. Although it was her right as first wife to run the household, she withdrew more and more from the family. She spent her waking hours embroidering obsessively on a huge altar cloth of heavy red silk, but never seemed content with her work. For each time she completed a section of embroidery, she would pick it apart to start over again until the heavy red silk was perforated with tiny needle holes. The embroidered figures she stitched were of little boys, each dressed differently, each in a different pose. One played with a ball, another chased a small dog, one napped under a tree. She was making 100 boys' altar cloth for the temple. First wife was barren. Despite the herbal remedies and nourishing broth she consumed to balance her body's energies, all her efforts were futile. Because of this, Master Yang had taken a second wife, the woman who had been Da Jing and Andrin's mother. After second wife died in childbirth, Master Yang married third wife, and the cheerful young woman had become pregnant almost immediately with a son. After this, first wife began making weekly visits to the temple where she burned incense and prayed with fanatical fervor. Master Yang had suggested she adopt one of their many nephews. But my duty is to give you a son of my own body, she wept when he made the suggestion. It was no shame for childless women to adopt a child from another branch of the clan, but she refused. This was the first sign that she wasn't behaving normally. She could have finished that altar cloth years ago, I said to Fox, I being the little girl and Fox
Mm.
being the fox spirit who's there to help her. She could have finished that altar cloth years ago, I said to Fox, if she didn't pick out the stitches all the time. Fox raised one perfect eyebrow. If she finished the cloth, Fox said, she would have to produce a son.
Oh.
So this is,
Interesting.
there's a number of different things that are woven into this
Mm.
incident. One was how important it was for a woman to give a son to the family, how her status in the family could be diminished if
Mhm.
she didn't, how her status in the family could actually be overtaken by that of a lesser wife who did have a son. About this belief that if you embroidered an altar cloth with 100 baby boys and you presented it to the temple, then you would be successful and become pregnant with a
Mhm.
boy. So this is just the way that a woman's actions will tell you what is going on in terms of her status in the family, what she believes,
Mhm.
and what she's suffering
Yeah.
because
Oh,
she can't have a boy.
yeah. That was just amazing. I could picture that altar cloth like it was right in front of me. And I think, yeah, that sort of using that visual cue, yeah, says so much. The idea you have that 100 baby boys on the altar heavy with the heavy red silk and doing it over and over again. Yeah, says everything. Yeah. Yeah. So yes, exactly, because you get that significance because it can't just show it if in historical fiction when something was incredibly important to them at the time, how to relay that without, basically just
Turning it into a history lesson, right? It's
yeah, no,
because
that was
then,
beautifully
it takes
done.
people, because I think when people read historical fiction, what they're looking for is escape, is for
Yep.
immersion in the world of that novel, right?
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah, which you do beautifully. Yeah, I feel like I'm in all those certain places. And you choose like very unique situations, but also, specific but broad at the same time, I suppose, right? They're encapsulated within a certain sort of crucible of Chinese culture. I think, yeah. So thank you so much for that. That was wonderful. I think we're going to get to the questions now. April, is it?
Yes, hi, let me unmute myself and I'm going to come and join you there. Yeah, I've been collecting some questions. Thank you, Janie. That was an amazing reading too, just to get inside the world. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
I've been gathering the questions and we have some mostly related to process of
Mhm.
sort of set those aside. But if you don't mind me asking one very practical question, it's because it comes from Elizabeth, and I missed her question on the last one, so I kind of owe her the first position, and she asked it first. So I'm going to go into technical writing business first, and then we'll move back into craft. Elizabeth asks, for aspiring Canadian novelists, is it worth querying American agents, since there's so many more of them than Canadian, or not? And what are the pros and cons of querying American versus Canadian agents? Maybe you've already, tried that for yourself or not. So we'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I've had 2 agents, and they've both been American, and they can sell to both Canadian and US publishers. And if it's, face it, the US is a bigger market. But a Canadian agent and a Canadian publisher takes better care of you because we're a smaller community of writers. So it kind of depends on what you want, And I think the most important thing is to find an agent who is sympathetic to your genre. So my first agent was a lovely person, but when it turned out that I was writing historical fiction, her true love was actually like not historical fiction. So my current agent has a very deep portfolio of historical novelists. So, and that's really great too, because when you talk about community, it means that we can cry on each other's shoulders about, history and research. And does the market really is the market tired of World War II yet? Should we be moving into a different era? That sort of thing. So I think if you want to be published in Canada, definitely, I think a Canadian agency is really good. I think what Transatlantic, and I can't remember, there's a couple of really big ones and individuals as well. Yeah.
Okay, I think that's helpful. When you, just out of curiosity to follow up on that question too, did you research agents and query them, or did some of your writing kind of attract the attention of one that you decided to work with?
I researched agents and the Surrey International Writers Fest, and a lot of these Writers Fests will bring in agents who are looking to expand their portfolios, right?
Yeah.
And it turned out, well, with my first agent, it turned out that she was with the same boutique agency that represented Amy Tan and Lisa C. and Maxine Hong Kingston. And in those days, I thought, oh, Chinese female authors, that's what I want. But as it turned out, even though they were famous for representing those authors, my particular agent was not the one representing those authors, and so as you mature into the industry and you have a better sense of what it is that you're writing, it turned out it wasn't so much being a Chinese Canadian female author as it was historical fiction. So I needed to work with someone who was really good at understanding that particular market, who would attend the Historical Novel Society conference every year, that sort of thing. And fortunately, by this time, I had a few author friends who were historical novelists, and they recommended my current agent to me. So
good. Okay, so definitely what I'm hearing the highlight is lean
Genre.
into the genre, lean into
Yes.
what you're writing about. Great.
Yes.
So because you do historical fiction, there's a lot about questions about family history and researching. So Kat asks, when researching, do you do oral interviews at all? And if so, how do you respectfully incorporate them in your stories?
I've never really had that problem because the only people that I have interviewed face to face have been my parents and some of my aunts and uncles back in China. And I really did that to document family history, because back then I really had no clue that I was going to end up writing novels. And by the time I wrote my first book, my father had passed away and my mother had dementia. So neither of them, I mean, ever knew that I'd become an author. But my brother was very pleased that I had incorporated our ancestors into the story respectfully, very specifically our grandfather, who was kind of he was kind of a loser. But in the story, he was a very sympathetic person who was, his life was because of his circumstances, his upbringing. So my brother said, I'm really pleased that you didn't, that you wrote so respectfully and in such an understanding way about our grandfather. And we never knew the guy, right? We only knew him from family stories. And as you know, Chinese families are, really value reverence towards their elders. So if someone tells you that grandpa was a loser, he must have been really bad. So
If it got that far, if it trickled down that far, I can imagine though that dramatic conflict and respect may sometimes not always go together. So that may be a fine edge to walk too.
Yes.
Ghislaine has I hope I'm pronouncing your name properly. Ghislaine says, regarding family, it's more of a comment than a question. Regarding family history, even if people are dead, you can dig up stories through old newspapers if your ancestors were on the right or wrong side of the law. I thought I found both, LOL. I thought that was kind of interesting. And being willing to show those things and for the story. Cynthia asks, with regard to historical fiction, when you're deep in research, how do you know when to pull back and write again and vice versa? So kind of finding that balance. Is it a back and forth movement for how you're doing that process?
That is just one of the worst dilemmas of all, because you don't write historical fiction unless you love history. And you can go down these research rabbit holes, and the way we describe it is, we think we're being so productive, and actually we haven't written a single word yet. So what I tend to do is I give myself 6 months. And during those 6 months, it's to do the overall research of that era, find, any meaningful personalities in that era, whether or not it was feasible that any of my characters might have overlapped with those characters, or just forget about it and just leave them like in the background as, some famous person was doing something at this point in the story and it showed up in the newspaper and my character read about it. You can decide how much depth you want to give that real person. And a lot of it, the research, is also to get a sense for how ordinary people live, because it is so easy to get the names of generals, the year that the battle was fought, and how many people died, and all that stuff. But, the really, really basic things that we wouldn't even think about. So, for example, in the Library of Legends, we have all these students from a very sophisticated city called Nanjing, and they are walking 1,000 miles to get away from the invading armies. What do they do when their shoes wear out? They have these fancy leather shoes for rich city kids. What do they do? And it never even occurred to me until I read a memoir, and one of these students had said, and they would stop at villages, and they would buy straw sandals and strap them over their leather shoes so that they were wearing out the straw sandals and not their leather shoes. Or or I really wish I had asked my father, but Dad, how did you get letters from home? How did you write letters home when the country was at war? Was there a postal service that was functioning? Those sorts of really simple things, right?
Yeah, things we
So
take for granted. Yeah.
the things that we take for granted, or it never would occur to us that this might have been difficult, right?
So this leads into the next question about research, because it's about finding these maybe hard to find things. Veronica asks, how do you research the folklore and magical components of your stories, especially if it's based on cultural traditions, not necessarily recorded on the internet?
Mm,
So how, you're finding these ways to dig around for the details. Any tips?
you end up having to buy the books. So when, of course, we always start with Wikipedia, but the nice
Mhm.
thing about Wikipedia is you then go down to the references at the very bottom of each of the articles and you start looking at the books. And then you see whether or not those books are available. I also subscribe to JSTOR, JSTOR, and for an annual subscription, you can like search on their database and there's things in there like articles from academic journals, people's thesis, chapters from different, um, the books that people put together where it's all on a different topic. Sorry, all about the same topic, but different people are writing about it. I can't even remember what that's called right now. So I subscribe to a service like that for a lot of the research. And then at the end of the day, you end up having to buy the books. And if you are brave enough, you reach out to the author of those books. So when I wrote The Porcelain Moon, which is about the Chinese Labor Corps in France, I actually got in touch with the curator of a museum in Ypres in Belgium
Mhm.
because he had written a book about the Chinese Labor Corps, and there was an exhibit about the Chinese workers during the First World War on the Western Front. So I got in touch with him and we talked, and we had an email correspondence. And when he finished writing his next PhD thesis, he sent me an early copy, and then there was also another guy who lived in Hong Kong, a British historian, and he had a book that was, I swear, it's like this thick about the Chinese Labor Corps. Because in France, because I noticed like the other books that I got on the topic, they always reference this guy's book. So I got in touch with him. And
Yeah.
I have this really stupid question, Gregory, and he would answer, right? So that's lovely.
And so that was a case where you were already had the Chinese Labor Corps in the story, and you set out
Hmm.
to find out more about them, and it led to that research. Did it
Yes.
did it ever did it ever happen in the reverse way, where you were researching something and then a whole new idea emerged from something you read that you then incorporated into the story
Yeah.
all the
Pretty
time?
much. Yeah, pretty much. So the the Chinese Labor Corps story, actually, the research for that popped up when I was, sorry, the information about that popped up when I was researching the Library of Legends. I don't know how, but it just popped up. And I mentioned serial monogamy for writing, and I just had to put that away and decide that I had to make my deadlines for the Library of Legends and then go into researching the Chinese Labor Corps because it was just so amazing to me that 140,000 men from China had been shipped over to the Western Front, had done all this work, dug the trenches, cleared up the barbed wire after the war was over, and then just kind of vanished into history, right?
Mm.
What was going on? Why had they been forgotten? What did they actually do? Did any of them stay behind in France and in England? So, yeah.
Well, I'm so glad you went to that trouble of, what did you say, capturing that story, not just writing it down, but capturing the story and conjuring it for us. It's beautiful. If you're okay with a couple more questions here,
You bet.
a bit more about process and from Cindy and Diane, and then I want to um, ask you a question of my own if I can fit it in at the end. Um, this is about character. Did either of your main characters ever demand to veer off the planned storyline? Now, Cindy, I'm not sure which characters you're referring to, if they're specific ones, but maybe you mean did any of your main characters?
Gosh, let me think about that. I think, I think it just things I used to
Oh,
write more or I used to
yeah,
write more organically, you know. Um, so sometimes it just seemed as though my character would say, "No, this is what actually happened," And I don't know about you guys, April and Claire and Roberta, but there are those moments when, if you've done the work and you've thought about it really hard and you're trying to figure something out, your characters will talk back to you. And I just remember in Three Souls when my main character is wondering why, you know, her brother seems so jealous that she is in love with this poet, with this, very handsome, romantic poet. And suddenly it just came to me because her brother was also in love with him. And it was, I never thought about it before, but it was just like, it just hit me in a flash, and it was exactly the right reason. It was exactly the right thing. And it is the best feeling in the world. I've never done cocaine, but I am sure it was at least as good as taking cocaine. You get that feeling, right? When your characters are telling you what's supposed to happen. And I think that's what keeps us going as writers. We're waiting for that next hit.
Sometimes it's a long wait too.
Yeah.
But Cindy did answer my question. She was saying, referring specifically to the Phoenix Crown, which is interesting because that was you and Kate working together. So
Yes.
if one of your characters went off track, it would have really impacted the other. So did that
Mhm.
ever happen in the writing of that story, given how you explained your regimen with each other?
Well, we actually, it was a good thing that we were discussing story beforehand, and while we were working on the spreadsheet, and we had sort of semi-written a number of chapters already, and we were looking for ways of, originally Su Ling had, there were hints that she had a lover who had vanished, and Gemma had come to San Francisco also looking for a friend. I'm sorry, this is spoiler territory. And I don't
Warning,
know.
warning.
Yeah, warning, warning. And then we just kind of looked at each other and said, what if they were the same person? Because you're always looking for ways to tie things together. How can these two women who are so totally different somehow end up bound to each other? And we had been tossing around a number of different ideas, and this was the one, you know.
So you came to it together, like
We
almost like
came to it together. Yeah.
the
But
two.
I think that the real character, like one of the real people in the Phoenix Crown, is a woman named Alice Eastwood. And she really was the director of botany for the California Academy of Sciences during the time of the Great Earthquake. And she really did like climb up the framework of a staircase to try and rescue these precious plant specimens that, were then used as like the reference library for plant species of plants. And she was just such an amazing character that if we had let her, she would have taken over the whole story, you know.
She wants her own
So
book.
yeah, she definitely merits her own book.
Yeah. Thank you. That's really helpful. It's so fun for all of us to get sort of a background peek, behind the scenes peek into these stories. Diane also has kind of a process question. Each of your novels seem to take place in different times and places, different settings. Do you advise moving around? And if so, what are the advantages or disadvantages of moving around or staying put in a time and place?
I think that what the time and places that I choose, what makes them the same, what they have in common, is that it is a time when women in the story are facing a transition. They can they're lacking in agency. Thank you, Chinese cultural traditions. But they can see what's possible, in because, for example, in Shanghai, there were schools run by missionary women. There were hospitals staffed by Western women, doctors and nurses. There was a hospital which was entirely staffed by Western female doctors and nurses, because otherwise Chinese women would not go to that hospital if they were going to encounter men, that sort of thing. The more progressive and wealthier families would allow their daughters to be educated abroad in England or in the United States or Japan or whatever. So I always find it really interesting to have a situation where someone has one foot in a traditional life with traditional obligations, and yet, can see across the horizon and is striving for some level of independence, for some level of agency, and the biggest, I think the biggest challenge in these cases is to make it really clear to someone who's not familiar with the culture, who's not familiar with that era, how difficult it is. Because not me, but another author friend who writes about, 18th 18th century China got the comment was, oh, well, I really loved your main character, but I wish she could have been more of a feminist. And it's like, you know what? Feminism in those days was not even a word, and feminism as a concept in China in those days did not exist. So some very small thing, such as learning how to read and write, was actually a huge deal. So how do you write a novel that also makes it clear that this woman has actually achieved something amazing that we take for granted?
I really like what you're saying about kind of having a character has one foot kind of stuck in one place, but their eyes on the possibility of another, as being a great starting point for a story. And maybe would you say that the reason for moving around in stories with different settings maybe has to come from the character, from that character's journey that you're planning for her, might be what directs those movements?
Yeah, I think that the situations are quite different. So, for example, in the Porcelain Moon, it's before the First World War, well, just before and during the First World War, and there's hardly any Chinese in France at all. I think they counted back in those days, there were like 83 or something living in Paris. But that also meant that my character, who's been transplanted from China to go help her uncle work in this antique store, not only does she have her life in the antique store and family obligations, but she's living in Western society. What must that feel like? What are the inner conflicts that are going on? And then in my other stories, it's sort of like they have to overcome a number of different things, like family obligation versus passion and love, or being not just poor and orphaned and Chinese, but to be biracial, and the difficulties thereof, that sort of, yeah.
Really interesting. Thank you for that work. I know we're getting close to the end, but can I fit in another question? There's a couple of, well, I'm going to be selfish and ask my own question here, because I want it to be sort of a question for writers based on some things that you said in your talk with Claire. One was that you mentioned what was like having maturity, discipline, and the life experience to be ready to write was one aspect, and how that takes some time to build in a life. You mentioned that you were wondering, when you were maybe looking at the nursing care with your mom, all those people, did they pursue their dreams enough? Did they try hard enough? And that really gave you the impetus to move on. And then that idea that there's dementia potentially waiting at the far end. So got me thinking, oh, is this kind of, how wide is this window of having the wherewithal, the personal wherewithal, plus the skills, plus the opportunities before, time runs out? I think a lot of people sort of feel that. So I just wondered if you could speak to that in terms of your own process and experience, and maybe if you have any advice for writers struggling with the same kinds of things.
Well, honestly, when that revelation hit, it really scared the bejesus out of me, because it was like, as you said, how much time do I have? How long does it take, to write a novel? And the other thing is, how badly do I want this, right? Because I think for a lot of us women in particular, we tend to put our own goals and our own dreams on the back burner, because on the front burner, you've got family and kids and your job and I don't know, housekeeping for heaven's sake, and these all seem to get in the way. And in addition to being suddenly scared and sort of with this vision of myself in a rocking chair thinking, oh, why didn't I try harder? Um, the other thing that gave me impetus was signing up for the writer's studio because I had paid money. So now I had to get my money's worth out of it. So it was like paying that tuition fee was made you accountable, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and then of course, once you're in the class, you have to turn up with a piece of writing, which in my case was, more of Three Souls, the book that I was going to finish in my 1 year of being in the writer's studio. How stupid was that back then? And you get the feedback on it and you learn the craft of how to improve it. And it's very, very motivating. So it's really, how much do you really want this that you're willing to, well, in my case, step back from some freelance work that I was doing, so earning less so that I had the time to write. My poor husband had to learn how to cook because I was not making dinner every night. And so it's, in a lot of ways, it's also a family decisions. You
Yeah.
you need, a writer needs family support. That's all I can say. Now I know why people always dedicate their books to their spouse.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's part of community too. You've got your writing community, but you have a life community too of people who are kind of cheering you on. You mentioned earlier on too that in this short time window, I was thinking, what are some of the shortcuts that you might have for us? So I'm going to just set you up for this question. You already mentioned knowing the business sooner than later, so don't avoid that. Get to know the business of writing. Maybe plot sooner than later. Work on your plot and your outlining. It's more efficient. You mentioned both those things. If you had to add one more thing or two that you were going to say to people to maybe bring in sooner than later, would it be a strong work ethic, a writing partner, or focusing on what you love to read the most?
I would say the strong work ethic of writing, just writing every day, because the writing part of your brain is like a muscle. You have to exercise it, right? When we sit on a panel at a writing workshop and someone from the audience says, but I have to feel inspired to write. We just kind of look at each other, and it's like, you need to write. You can write crap, but you can always edit crap. You cannot edit a blank sheet of paper. So even if it's terrible, get it down. You can always go back and make it better. So I
I
should
think
follow that more often myself. So
I think, yeah, it's just a reminder for all of us, but I think that's a great foundation. And then on top of that, you get to add what you love to read and in bringing in partners. But without that strong work ethic, without that commitment to the creative process, there isn't much to work with.
the thing is, a novel is 100,000 words. If you write 2,000 words a day, how long do you think it takes, like, to write? And you're not going to write 2,000 words every day. That's if you're, just, incredibly productive, right? And then you have to go back and, revise and move pieces of the story around. 100,000 words is a lot of work, So
I know I always call this writer's math. So you like spreadsheets. I like spreadsheets. It's like you can do the calculations and figure out if it can work or not. But yeah, it's a reality check, isn't it? Yeah. So thank you for so much for answering those questions. Someone was asking about historical novel conferences.
Oh, it's called the Historical Novel Society, and every other year they have a conference in the US and they go like from one coast to the other, or, more or less east to west. And then every other year it's the Historical Novels Society conference in the UK. So you could go to that one as well. And I understand there's one in Australia. So obviously, in the past, I've gone to the one in the US.
Okay, that's
which
great.
we're
Maybe we can,
boycotting.
yeah, right. We'll put that in the notes then. I guess we can include some of those things in the notes.
But they
Um,
are doing, ever since the pandemic, they've been doing sort of hybrid workshops. So they'll Zoom also.
okay.
Awesome.
Okay, good. Well, thank you so much for answering all those questions. I'm gonna just hand the torch back to Claire so that she
Oh.
can thank you officially. And I'm full of gratitude and yeah, really happy that we got to spend time with you and get to
Yes.
know a bit about you and the writing process and your books. So
And
let's
meet
go out
you
and
in
buy them
person. Meet you in person one
and
day,
meet you in
April.
person. Yeah, I hope so too. Okay.
Yes, thank you everyone for coming, and thank you, Janie. I just want to say thank you too for people who shared their stories of ghostly encounters. Some of these are very moving and very powerful. And I think thinking of how that could inspire a story or become a not necessarily a story itself, but how just the feeling that you have when you tell these stories, how you can use those in your writing, I think is very important. Yeah, but they're wonderful. Thank you for sharing those. And Janie, thank you so much for coming.
Okay.
Thank
It was
you. This was
fun.
wonderful.
Always is fun when Claire's in the room.
But I can't wait for this new novel.
Mhm.
I think it's going to be fabulous. And so thank you for telling us about that. And it's going to be a little bit of a genre shift for you. So I think that's going to be really cool. Yeah.
Yes. So, all righty.
All right. We'll
Well,
see
thank
you.
you,
We'll see you.
everyone. Bye bye.
Yeah. Bye.